Adolf Hitler may be the most infamous man in human history. He was responsible for the destruction of millions of lives of countless countries, including his own. But more on that in a moment. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. You are listening to Biocast Addendum. In this episode, we are going to be taking a look at who Adolf Hitler really was as a human being. I strongly encourage you guys to check out the Adolf Hitler Biocast episode with a little bit more information. It goes into a little bit more depth than what we're going to be doing here. This is just going to be a brief overview. The Hitler Biocast episode goes into extreme detail. A link to that will be in the show notes or description. So without any further ado, let's get right into the episode. So Hitler was born to farming peasants in Austria-Hungary. Basically in the middle of nowhere. They were pretty lowly people. I mean, they were not even literate. So you can kind of get an understanding for the background he was coming from. He was an ethnic and cultural German. Now, he lived in Austria-Hungary, but he was an ethnic and cultural German. Really important to understand how he was kind of like a weird minority group within this behemoth country. His father was extremely abusive, and you can really make a lot of judgment on his father because now this was someone that beat his kids. He was extremely authoritarian and strict. He stopped them from doing things that they wanted to do. He had multiple kids with different women. I think there were like 3 or 4 women in total, a bunch of kids. He was just an all-around bad guy. Now, Hitler, from a very young age, he identified with the pan-German movement. He was basically a German nationalist. And that was despite not being a German citizen and living in Austria-Hungary. So he regularly fought with his father. Him and his father had a lot of disagreements. He wrote in Mein Kampf about how they were both extremely strong-willed. They were both extremely just disagreeable. They really could not get along. And if they set their minds to it, they would die, they could really die on a hill. And one of the things that they really had this big disagreement over was Hitler becoming an artist. You see, his father, Alois, he had become a civil servant. He was basically a bureaucrat for the government. And he was like, listen, buddy, this is how I did it. This is how you're going to do it. And this question of becoming an artist or not, this is going to be something that lasts forever. And they never really get over this disagreement. And I mean, it lasts even after his father dies. And it's just really tragic because when you have a real big problem in a relationship and then the person dies, I mean, it kind of leaves you with this unresolved feeling, right? It's pretty sad, actually. And then he becomes friends with August Kubizek when he was a teenager. And August Kubizek was a young Austrian German. And they both loved the arts. They loved music. They met at an opera house. They really loved Richard Wagner. And they were just 2 peas in a pod. They couldn't be closer. Best friends. So Hitler left school at age 16. He never really pursued school that much, and he was only there because his father wanted him to be there. But his father dies, and now he's like, well, I don't have to really be here anymore. His mom let him leave. His mom was really, really permissive, and she just kind of lets him go along and do whatever he wants, really. So him and August, they go to Vienna together. Now, I talk a lot about this in a recent Biocast Addendum episode. I kind of go into August Kubizek's The Young Hitler I Knew, because he writes a memoir and everything about it. He's actually really honest and forthright with how things really were. I strongly encourage you to check that out. A link to that will be in the description or show notes as well. But him and August, they go to Vienna together. This was like a big thing, right? Well, let's go become artists. August wanted to become a musician. Hitler wanted to become a painter. Best buds in the world. They're like, yeah, let's do it. Let's make it happen. Well, they get there, and Hitler is rejected from Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts. It is a tragic blow. He applies more than one, I believe it was twice in total. And the recruiter there, he basically tells him, he's like, listen, man, you're a really good artist, but I think you would be a better architect than a painter. But the problem there is that he doesn't have the necessary schooling to become an architect. So I'm sure he's just looking back like, wow, I really wish I didn't leave school at 16 years old. It would have been really nice to have that couple of more years of school, because then maybe I could become an architect. But he didn't have the necessary schooling to become an architect, and he didn't have the skills to become a painter. He's just kind of left in the blue here. And it's all the worse because August, his dreams come true. He gets into the music school that he wanted to get into. And so now they're two best buds. And Hitler doesn't even tell him that. He doesn't even tell him he's been rejected. So I'm sure it just ate Hitler alive. To him and his best friend, they make this big move. They go all the way to Vienna, living in the big city. His dreams fall flat. He's a complete failure. And his friend is succeeding. Must have just been horrible. So he eventually just left his friend. Just straight up disappeared one day. And then he became a drifter, and he was basically homeless. Didn't have anyone. He didn't have any structure in his life. And by this point, his mom's dead. His father's dead. He's not really that close with any of his family. He doesn't have, and his only friend in the world now, he just totally leaves his only friend. Just to go and become homeless, and feeling sorry for himself. So he has nowhere to go. No structure, no one. And then World War I breaks out. And that is what gives Hitler a reason to be alive. So he enlists in the Bavarian army in 1914. An interesting side note, he should not have been allowed to join because he was an Austrian citizen. People have speculated that this was just some kind of paperwork error, but he was not supposed to have been allowed to fight for Bavaria because he wasn't Bavarian. He was an Austrian. So it's just one of those weird things. You almost have to wonder what would have happened had he not been allowed to fight for Germany in World War I, but we'll leave this speculation for another episode. So he served as a runner in no man's land. However, that wasn't the only thing he did. He did spend time behind the front lines in relative safety, just doing general military stuff. And this is actually a big point of debate. A lot of people argue, oh, he spent all his time in no man's land. He was a brave, heroic leader. And then there are other people that are like, oh, he was just sitting behind the front lines. He didn't really do anything that crazy. You know, it just kind of depends. I feel like a lot of people allow their own personal opinion, whether or not they're a Hitler sympathizer, to kind of paint it, their view, or a Hitler sympathizer or hater. But the truth is, he spent time doing both. We can debate over how much time doing what, but it doesn't, is this something that really matters? I don't think so. He was in no man's land, and he was behind the front lines at different times. So again, whatever. So he was awarded the Iron Cross, which is a very prestigious award. Very prestigious. It was a really big deal because one of his superior officers went to bat for him. He noticed that this guy was just as radical, pro-Germany, ultra-high morale, and let's get everyone together and go win this war. I mean, he was just the ideal person in the military. And the ironic thing is that this officer that went to bat for him was Jewish. And this guy later had to flee Germany during the Third Reich. Kind of really see how he paid this commanding officer back in kind for really going sticking his neck out for Hitler. It's pretty sad. Hitler was injured a couple times during the war, but toward the end it gets really bad. He was temporarily blinded by mustard gas in 1918, and this is shocking. It was really bad. He was really worried about not getting his vision back. I mean, just think about being temporarily blinded. You're not sure. I mean, it's really stressful, kind of traumatic. And then Germany surrenders while he's in the hospital. And he actually talks about, in Mein Kampf, he says that he had recovered from his temporary blindness, and then he's okay for a couple of days, and then he learns that Germany surrendered, he goes blind again. So whether or not that's true, it really gives you a good indication of how seriously a blow it was to his mind, his psyche. It was psychologically painful for him to know that Germany lost. So of course, him and a bunch of other thinkers at the time, they blamed the Marxists, the Jews, the traitors, because there's all of this controversy, right? So Germany, during this war, it was hands down the best individual country out of anyone, right? They were the most powerful. They had so much manpower, so much industrialization. They just had everything going for them. But the problem was that they were fighting the world. You're fighting France, Russia, the UK. There are just so many different people that you're fighting against. And who are Germany's allies? Austria-Hungary, kind of backward, smaller country. And then the Ottoman Empire. They didn't really have any good allies during this war. So it just kind of became this entire... Well, the reason we lost is because of the Marxists, the Jews, people, the Democrats. They signed this agreement with the Allies, and it just turned into this horrible thing where they're just trying to point the fingers. And this leads to the stab in the back theory, where they basically believe that Germany should have won. But the reason that they didn't was because of all of these traitors. Now again, they were fighting the world, and then I think the real turning point in the war was in 1916 when the United States came into the war, because that added a whole bunch of supplies, a whole bunch of new troops that are now fresh. These guys haven't been in the trenches for 2 years like everyone else has. That was the real turning point in the war. And of course, it's never like, listen, we tried to fight the world and lost. It's, we tried to fight the world, almost won, but then we got stabbed in the back. And this hatred will really materialize in the coming years. So he becomes politically active after the atrocities of the Treaty of Versailles. And let's not beat around the bush. The Treaty of Versailles was an atrocity, because what it did was it unduly punished Germany for all of the wrongs of World War I. Now we can go into a lot of detail about the causes. Germany definitely played a part, right? Like, let's not pretend that they didn't. They were not completely blameless. But what caused World War I was not solely Germany's fault. And that's really important to understand, especially because they were under an absolute monarchy. How are you going to blame and hold responsible tens of millions of people for the actions of a monarch, right? It really isn't fair to the German people. And at some point, the French especially, they just completely ravaged Germany. There's all of this war debt. They already lost millions of people. The economy's already destroyed. We're talking war-torn Germany here. And then on top of that, there's all these reparation payments. And then when Germany can't make the reparation payments, France just goes in and starts taking stuff. They just go, and not government stuff either, stuff from civilians. So you have to imagine losing a war now, and your greatest, most antagonistic enemy comes into your territory and starts stealing stuff from your citizens. Just imagine living through that. You can't even imagine how angry these people must have been. Even people from the Soviet Union observe how Germany was basically forced to become this extremist nation because France were too worried about their interest payments. Even foreign observers were like, listen, man, you're being kind of harsh on Germany here. Well, France is gonna get that back in kind. So all of this leads Hitler to get politically active. And he becomes an intelligence agent for the German military for a short time. And again, he doesn't have any skills. He's a failed painter. The military is really the only way he's going to make something of himself. So one of his first tasks was to infiltrate the German Workers' Party, the Deutsches Arbeiterpartei. And they were basically this small political extremist group that they had been gaining some traction, but they weren't like a real threat. They just had the potential to become a real threat. And around this time, he writes the Gemlik letter, where he basically talks about the Jewish question, really shows his first inklings of anti-Semitism, where he really starts blaming the Jews for what went wrong in Germany. And he argued that the government's aim was to, quote, must unshakably be the removal of the Jews altogether. So very early on, the Jews are responsible for what has happened in our country, for the devastation on our people. And, well, that's the government's job is to get rid of these people. And that's really, it's going to come to materialize in a few short years here. So he became heavily involved with this party. I mean, he was technically an infiltrator, but he started really believing some of the things that these radicals were saying. And he started really taking charge. He changed the name to NSDAP. So the Nationalsozialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And this is really important, right? Because it'll attract a whole bunch of people from different political ideas and different trains of thought to this one overarching party. So if you're a nationalist, you're welcomed here. If you're a socialist, you're welcomed here. And then you've got the Workers' Party, and that's kind of a play on the communist phrasing. I mean, this entire thing is just a really smart way to attract as many people as you can. I mean, if you go on Google and you try to just spam as many keywords as you can, I mean, they have an algorithm that's going to detect it. There's no algorithm to stop keyword spamming for the German Workers' Party. So Hitler's just like, yeah, man, let's just take all the good political words that people like from regardless of their political orientation, slap it onto the name of this new party. And that's where the Nationalsozialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei comes from. So really smart if you think about it. And then he also designs the swastika himself, which is probably one of the most iconic symbols ever. And he went full-time for the NSDAP in 1920. That's where he really starts going all in. He's like, all right, this is my everything. We're going to make a go of this thing. Now, he was inspired by Benito Mussolini's March on Rome. You see, Mussolini, it was pretty easy for him to just get a few of his fascist buddies together, and they go and they march on the government, and they basically show up with guns and say, listen, man, we're the government now. And that is really how they took power. So Hitler takes this inspiration by Benito Mussolini and basically tries to take over the government in Munich, Bavaria. He wants to establish his own Nazi little dictatorship over there and hopefully take control of the entire country as well. I'm not exactly sure what his plans were here, but his attempt fails and he ends up in prison. So this is where he writes Mein Kampf, which is basically his political manifesto in a way. He goes into a lot of detail. It's almost autobiographical at a lot of points. And it's really weird because it's this strange combination of, yeah, this is who I am. This is my life story. And then this is my political ideology and our manifesto to taking over Germany. And it's just really strange. And I think it kind of sets the stage for how he becomes this insane narcissist and really puts himself at the center of the political struggle in Germany. I mean, Nazism is nothing without Hitler. Hitler is, he's the entire thing. He's der Führer, eventually, right? So his whole philosophy, his whole political ideology is based on, well, me. I'm at the center of it all. And that's how he feels about it. It's really insane. So he rebuilds the party. He sees that taking over the government with a gun is not necessarily the answer. So what he does is he really goes out of his way to attract far left and right wing thinkers to the party. And again, this is where he really starts honing in on those keywords, right? The nationalists, the socialists, the communists. Like there are a whole bunch of these people that end up getting attracted to this party because, well, he'll go to a place that he knows is very left-leaning, and then he'll start saying about the workers and socialism and this. He'll say a bunch of stuff like that. And then he'll go to a group that he knows is a nationalist organization. He'll say, yeah, the fatherland, and we're going to rebuild the country. And, so he just plays all of these words and emphasizes them differently to different crowds, which was really smart. Unfortunately, it led to the rise of the Nazis, but it was really smart and effective. And the weird part about this whole situation was that the Nazis were very much anti-democracy. They didn't believe in people having the right to vote. So he's operating in a democratic system where he's an anti-democrat. He doesn't believe in voting, but he has a political party that you can vote for. It's just this weird, really weird situation. I can't even imagine how strange it must have been to live through these times. The political turmoil and everything aside, it must have just been like, whoa, what? So he also used very powerful propaganda tactics to really grow the party as well. So one of these things was the anti-communist propaganda. So the whole reason that far-right thinking really took off during this time was because of the atrocities going on in the USSR. Again, remember, the Soviet Union was just established not too long ago. 1918, the end of World War I. That's when Russia starts becoming communist, and now they're just looking over their point. They're saying, look at what those communists are doing. They're committing atrocities, killing civilians, torturing people. Do you want that coming to your country? And it was really effective because it's not even so much that it's like propaganda where it's an outright lie. He didn't even really need to exaggerate anything because the communists were just so brutal. So brutal. And especially in the coming years, there's this Ukrainian famine where just millions of innocent Ukrainian farmers are starving to death. And it really serves as powerful ammunition for the Nazis to say, look at those filthy communists, what they're doing to those poor innocent people. And yeah, a lot of people buy into it. And he also was able to capitalize on the Great Depression. There was this horrible global economic recession that everyone was really feeling. It was bad. People were poor, especially in Germany. And he basically promises people, listen, man, I'm going to be able to bring back prosperity. I'm not promising everything in the world, but I can at least get us out of the depression. People, they're like, hell, listen, if you can feed us, well, I'll be happy. I've got 8 kids and we need food. And then he also sprinkles in a lot of anti-Semitism. A lot of it. And it's actually interesting because one of the guys I've read, Ernst Hanfstaengl, he says that the reason Hitler got so anti-Semitic was because he listened to a handful of crazy radicals in the Nazi party. And that definitely plays a big role because Hitler himself, he was actually one of the less anti-Semitic people in the Nazi party, which is really fascinating because it really shows you some of these other guys are even more off the wall nuts than he was. Very interesting, but more on that in another video. So at one time, 1/3 of the German voters supported the NSDAP, and that is in 1932. So by using all of these propaganda tactics, by using, look at the USSR and how bad they are, and really honing in on popular opinion, he's really able to grow this party into something big. And it had a lot of momentum. It had a lot of power. So he becomes chancellor. Now, the government had a lot of difficulty establishing a ruling party because the Weimar Republic was one of those, the political parties get their votes, and depending on those votes, they can have a certain amount of representation within their ruling coalition party. So there were all these different parties, and it's especially when you have like two polar opposites. I mean, they're trying to form a government with social democrats and conservatives, and like it's just this whole mishmash of different political parties trying to vie for power here. And they have a hard time ruling with equal authority. So then the Reichstag fire happens. And oh boy, that really gets the ball moving for a lot of things. So in response, the Reichstag fire decree is passed, believe it or not, by Hindenburg, not Hitler. So Hindenburg, who was the president at this time, he's actually in this picture right here. He is the one that's going to pass this thing, and it basically gives the government a lot more power. A lot more power. It basically is like, well, we're kind of under attack. And again, you got to think back. This is a new form of government for Germany, just a couple years old, and a lot of the people didn't even want this change to happen. There were a lot of Germans that were very pro-Kaiser. And now that the Kaiser's not in power anymore, and they're a democracy, well, a lot of people were angry about it. A lot of people did not want this to happen. So there's just inevitably going to be a lot of instability when you have a big, major change in government like that. So this basically turned into an excuse to suspend human rights, because that's what happens in practice. So there's no more freedom of speech, really. And if you're a political opponent of the government, we can now arrest you with no reason, and there's not anything you can do about it. And the craziest part is that Hitler, I mean, even as late as, the time World War II is going on, Hitler uses the Reichstag fire decree as a justification for a lot of the things he does. And it all goes back to this one bill. I'm sure Hindenburg probably would not have passed this bill had he known how it was going to be used in the future. And many historians believe it actually was this Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe. And there's a lot of debate. A lot of people say it was a false flag. But again, that's kind of a weird position to take, because if it was a false flag, if the Nazis really did set fire to the Reichstag building, well, that would have meant that they had Hindenburg completely in their pocket. And he kind of wasn't really in their pocket. I mean, he had some sympathies. He was more of a conservative, though. He was more kind of like a monarchist kind of guy. And a lot of the ruling class in Germany actually identified that, listen, these Nazis, they're not good news. They're not good news. And Hindenburg was kind of one of these people, but again, he ends up doing things that help the Nazis in the long run. So they also passed the Enabling Act, and this kind of gives the NSDAP 4 years of unlimited legal power. They can pass any laws. They don't need the permission of anyone else in the country. So between the Reichstag fire decree and the Enabling Act, they're basically the entire government. They control the entire show. And then, oh boy, the Night of the Long Knives happens. And this is in 1934. So the Nazi government, they take power in 1933. And just a year later now, they are purging their own political party, not just the country, right? So they are purging the country, but also their internal party. And they assassinate and imprison basically anyone that's an opponent of Hitler, which includes their comrades. I mean, there are people that are Nazi party members that get imprisoned, assassinated, exiled. Most notably, the Strasser brothers. And the Strasser brothers are really, really important to know because they represented the left-wing faction within the Nazi party. So a lot of people think that the Nazis were just complete nut jobs from day one. Not really how it was. Up to this point, they were a halfway respectable political entity. Now, don't get me wrong, the crazies were definitely in that party. I mean, Hitler was pretty much the leader throughout the entire time, but here's the thing. They had a lot of moderates. They had a lot of people that were left-wing. And with that in mind, they were able to kind of balance out the extremism. So you had this extreme right-wing element, but you also had a lot of left-wing thinkers, like most notably these Strasser brothers, and it kind of balances out, creates a more neutral party. Things are a little bit more sane. Things make a little bit more sense. But after this purge now, it's just unchecked right-wing authoritarianism. All political neutrality, there's just nothing. It's just all gone. It's just all gone. And now it's just, basically these nut jobs, these anti-Semitic, insane, nationalistic nut jobs can now just run the entire show. It's really sad. So they rebuild and restructure the entire economy and society. Now we can have a whole other presentation on how exactly they did that, but it really boils down to public spending, creating jobs, building the Autobahn, things like that. And it ends up being really efficient. I mean, a lot of people call it Hitler's economic miracle, but really he was just running up government debt. That's kind of what it was. And there's a lot of nuance to it, but he just basically ramps up government spending and encourages, he passes laws like encouraging mothers to have more kids, all kinds of things like that. And in just a couple years, they're going to go from complete powerhouse to economic ruin and desperation, and then back to an economic powerhouse. It's really important to note how that happened. So, World War II. Now this is where we get into the good stuff. So, pre-war Europe was looking pretty bad, and it really started showing with the Anschluss, or annexation of Austria. So again, Hitler's part of this German movement, right? The pan-German idea. So we're going to unite all the Germans in the world. Now, this is really tricky because there are like Germans everywhere. There are Germans in France and Russia and in Austria and all these different places. So that basically means are you just going to take over the whole world? And well, the first step to that was getting at least the Austrian Germans part of this German Reich. Then there was the Munich Agreement because, people started realizing, Hitler's kind of wants all of this land and power. He just wants to expand this empire. And it really was a good deal between Hitler and Chamberlain. People called it the great peace of our time. Everyone was, Hitler was such a great negotiator and Chamberlain. And we look back on this point in history and kind of call it appeasement. Kind of make Chamberlain out like he's this weakling that's giving in to Hitler, allowing Hitler to run rampant and just kill people and take land and expand his own power. I don't think you could have known until Hitler had broken the Munich Agreement. You just don't know, right? Until sometimes you pass a law or make an agreement, and then, it's not until afterwards that you find out, this guy really wasn't the good negotiator, the honest politician that he claimed to be. He was a nut job. So the Munich Agreement basically gives Hitler and Germany the Sudetenland, and they're like, listen, all right, we'll give you this more land. That's it. After this, no more. And Hitler agreed to stop annexing nations. Listen, man, no more. You got my word on it. And then Hitler invades Bohemia and Moravia. So much for Hitler's word. And this was in direct violation of the Munich Agreement. And then he invades Poland in 1939, but you see what he did. What he did was really sneaky, because the political situation at this time now is Germany is very expansionistic. They're kind of friendly with Italy, kind of friendly with Japan. But what is going on now is they are forcing an alliance between the UK, France, and Russia, and the United States kind of by extension. And what's going on now is they have this weird agreement with the Soviet Union. So they split Poland into two with the Soviet Union. They're like, maybe we can't take on the entire world again, but what we can do is buddy up with the Soviet Union, sign a non-aggression pact, and then we can get more land out of it. And that's exactly what they do. So now the Soviet Union's on their side, which is a big player, and now they can, well, what do you know, turn westward with their military, exactly like World War I. Like literally the exact same plan. Take out the West and then go east. So they invade France in 1940 and absolutely destroy it. Everyone talks about how easily France fell. It was just a couple of weeks. But the interesting part is that the Dutch, Flemish, and the Scandinavians were welcomed into the Reich. Again, this goes back to this pan-Germanic idea. This idea that we're going to unite the Germanic people. And that's not necessarily the Germans. I mean, it includes the Germans, but it's Germanic. It is an ethno group, basically anyone that is descended from the Vikings. So Italy and Japan, they sided with Germany back in 1939. And Italy almost sided with the Allies due to Hitler's antagonistic personality and ideas. And a lot of people actually don't know about this. Mussolini was less concerned with being ideological buddies with his allies than he was just being strategic. I mean, it ended up just being by chance that he ended up siding with Hitler. But I mean, Hitler, he was kind of a jerk. I mean, according to Hitler and the Nazi thinkers, the Italians were not Aryan. They were not Germanic. They were mixed with African blood. So the Italians, you see, they're ethnically inferior to us Germans. So you can just imagine the desperation that you have to be in to be siding with a country that thinks you and your people are ethnically inferior. I mean, I just couldn't imagine. Like, as bad as, the other, France and the UK, they were very antagonistic toward Italy, but at least they didn't call you ethnically inferior, man. Now, Hitler directly commanded military affairs despite his lack of military leadership experience. And he had enough to say, listen, man, I fought in the military. I was in World War I. I was a corporal. But listen, you were a corporal. Like, running some messages across no man's land does not make you smart enough to be able to lead the entire military. And turns out to be bad in the long run. There were a lot of German generals that strongly disagreed with this. They hated that Hitler took a direct commanding line on the military. But again, you look at the way the entire society was structured. His entire ideology revolved around, listen, I'm der Führer. I am the leader of these people. I need to control everything. That means the military too. And then many attribute Germany's defeat to Hitler's military incompetence. Because again, you don't become an expert in military planning and strategy overnight. It doesn't, especially like he just had no experience in this. Understanding how to, grow a political party, that's one skill. I don't think any of that transfers over to, I know how to run a military. And he just, again, his ego and his entire ideology would not allow him to allow the people that were the professionals to run the military. Now, it ends up being a good thing because, the Allies won. Thankfully, we're not living under a Nazi dictatorship right now. So, ends up being a good thing in the long run for us. But it was just his own insane ego and yeah. So then they launch Operation Barbarossa. They betray the USSR in 1941. This is where things really get insane. No one saw it coming. Stalin didn't even believe it. For like days, Joseph Stalin was in shock and awe. He could not believe that Germany had invaded. And he ends up fleeing. He literally flees. He leaves his office in Moscow and he's just like, it's over. He has a complete nervous breakdown and everything. But because of Hitler's direct intervention, they couldn't take Moscow. That was where they needed to attack. Now, Hitler looked to historical examples because everyone talks about, Hitler should have learned from Napoleon. Well, Napoleon, he invaded Moscow. He took over the city, but he didn't get the people because the Russians, they kept going farther east. I mean, they've got all of Siberia to retreat into, and they had Moscow, but it didn't work for them. So Hitler, he comes in and he's like, listen, forget Moscow. We need to just kill the people. And that's what he basically focused on. But you see, the circumstances were a lot different. And we can get into a lot of military strategy about this, but the German generals strongly disagreed with what he was doing. And they kind of say that Hitler, because of his direct intervention, he stops Germany from knocking out Russia as fast as they wanted to, as fast as they could have. What ends up happening is the Soviet Union turns the tide, and they completely overwhelm Germany with superior manpower. Now, Germany, militarily, economically, they were way superior to the Soviet Union. But the problem is that the Soviet Union's got so many more people, and not to mention the fact that they now allow women into the military. Germany doesn't. So Russia and the Soviet Union, they double their military power with allowing women. And then they've got all these different people that they can conscript into the Red Army. If you look at the casualty numbers, the wounded, the deaths by country, like the Soviet Union lost way more than anyone. Just millions and millions of men and women that fought in the Red Army. And it really boiled down to, well, the Soviet Union had more men and women than Germany had bullets. So that kind of gives that. I think that's a good way to understand how World War II went down without getting too in depth. So the Soviet Union is approaching. They're getting closer. The Allies are making headway. They're beating Germany in a lot of places. Italy's losing. Japan isn't doing so good. So Germany, they launch this new idea, Totalen Krieg, total war. At this point, the Nazis are like, listen, we're not going to lose. We're going to literally fight until the last man. We are going to die. All of us. Everyone. And it's just so insane because they start recruiting 12-year-old boys. It's just horrible. And it really boils down to just, we're going to do everything we can to stay in power. It's just really tragic for the German people because they had so many kids and innocent civilians that were just conscripted and just it was just horrible. Because not only did they have to suffer through all the horrors of World War I, that economic devastation, they've got to then live under Nazi Germany, and now World War II happens, they lose, and now they have to live under the horrors of the Soviet Union. So it's just horrible for the German people. The people Hitler claimed to love the most. He brought the most destruction. Of course, Hitler doesn't take any responsibility for his actions, so he just commits suicide. All hope is lost. Takes the coward's way out. And that is who Adolf Hitler really was. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. This has been Michael McCauley from Biocast Addendum. I will see you in the next one. Peace out.